Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of my fall series Essence podcast, Into the Woods, in which I venture into the woods to speak with folkloric and traditional practitioners from many, many different traditions. Today, I am finally interviewing, actually, I should say. I've been impatient for this myself. I'm really looking forward to it. Troy Kokoszka. Welcome, Troy.
Thank you, Ben. It's good to meet you.
It's good to meet you too. So for those of you who have been watching my channel, if you've been watching my YouTube channel, you'll know that I did a review of Bogowie, a study of Eastern Europe's ancient gods by Troy a couple of months ago, just at the end of the summer. If you haven't had a chance to go and see that, go and look in the review section of my YouTube. For those of you listening on on Spotify and other podcasting sites, go to my YouTube and find that. And I've really been looking forward to interviewing you, Troy, because this is such an amazing book. It really is.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear that. I never know what people are going to think. And I will say, even though my reading is very chaotic and it sort of rotates a lot, I am enjoying your book. I think some of the discussion on ancestry could be pretty fruitful.
Thank you. Yes, so we traded books back when I invited Troy onto the show, and we've been working through our each individual book, and I'm really curious to kind of hear what else you have to say about that by the end. So for those of you who don't know who Troy is, you may quite a few of you who are listening from like in the South and Texas area may know who Troy is, but for those who don't, Troy Kokoszka grew up in Texas with a Jewish mother and a Polish American father. While he was aware of roots going back to Eastern Europe from both families, he found it hard to learn very much about them. Troy is the author of course, Bogowie, Study of Western Europe's Ancient Gods. It's not simply a regurgitation of scholarship from the Soviet period. It presents new analysis by using previously neglected resources. Study of Eastern Europe's Ancient Gods offers one of the most painstakingly scholarly reconstructions of paganism, and it really is. It's a massive book. These new resources include not only an overview of folklore from many different Slavic countries and languages, such as Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Czechia, but also comparisons with Ossetian culture and Mordvin cultures, as well as a series of Slavic folk tales that Kokoszka analyzes in depth, often making the case that the narratives involved are mythological and ancient. And I know in there you also focus on many of the other Finno-Ugric communities as well, which was I thought fascinating. So if you are interested in hearing more from Troy, you can find him on TikTok at tt_kokoszka, and I will put that in the notes for people to find.
Yeah, that's TD. My apologies.
TD Kokoszka, right?
Yes.
Yes, there we go. We will make sure that gets put into the show notes, and also you can find him on where else? Where else can we find
him? On Facebook? That's a good place.
So that will be placed down in the show notes as well. So now that we've gotten through introducing you, Troy, how are you? How has it been going?
It's been going well. It's very difficult to gauge the early stage of a book, as I think you always expect some variation in the responses, but it's a pleasure to know that I am reaching a large number of people. I think with the internet it can be easy to just sort of scream into the emptiness and not be heard by anybody because there's just so much noise there. Whereas at least with a book you have some opportunity to cut through the noise just a little bit.
Absolutely. It's a very intimate sort of feeling, isn't it? It's a weird feeling, though, because on the one hand, you're engaging the conversation, but you really have no idea who's going to be up.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it definitely takes at least some conviction. I don't know if I would say it's courageous, but you definitely have to be willing to roll the dice a little bit.
You're not saying you're a bogatyr when it comes to writing these books, are you?
A bogatyr, yeah.
Right. So Okay, now I understand that you've done very few interviews so far, so I get to ask you some of the kind of preliminary questions, some of the 101 questions. So why this book? What persuaded you to put this massive book together? And I know you go into it a little bit in the book, but tell our audience also, how long did it take you?
So I mean, I guess, I should start at the beginning, which I talk about at the very end of the book. I talk about the beginning of the end. So basically, at the age of 14, that's when I really was introduced to Indo-European studies, which were kind of pivotal for me. I remember finding a book on my mom's shelf from the 1970s. I think it was Ancient Mysteries by Lionel Casson. A very old book now, as things go. But that was sort of my introduction to Indo-European studies, and this idea that, Greek and Sanskrit and Latin are all interrelated. It had this big impact on me. And I would say that that sort of framed the way that I would move forward, even though it didn't direct me automatically to the study of Eastern Europe or to the Slavs. I think it sort of put me on that trajectory a little bit. And that's part of why I think I brought a very different perspective to the study of a lot of this Slavic folklore, because I think I decided very early on with certain stories like Ivan the Cow's Son, for instance, that there really was something very ancient hidden inside these stories, and in some cases, Indo-European studies are instrumental for highlighting that. But it's more than that. I would say, ancestry is a good foot in the door for studying a culture. I definitely wouldn't say ancestry is required in order to get into a culture. But it can be a nice introduction, especially if it highlights a culture that you might otherwise overlook, because it's very easy to overlook certain cultures. There are certain cultures that don't show up in the popular consciousness very much. And ancestry can be a little nudge to say, oh, well, look at this one that you don't really hear much about. So it can be positive in that respect. And then I guess lastly, I would say that I'm a sucker for an untold story. And I think that this is very much an untold story.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's funny because what you just said reminded me of something that a previous guest had spoken about. I had Madame Pimita on, who is a Los Angeles-based spiritual practitioner. She has a shop over there, and she came out where she's of Ukrainian background and grew up in Southern California, really started to reconnect with her Ukrainian roots. And she said that something very similar. She said that it was nudge, that ancestral piece to connect in, kind of went exploring all over the place, hoodoo, southern conjure, but it was that call back to one's own ancestors that was pivotal. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to stress that I don't think connections of blood or genetics are necessary for establishing a connection to a culture, because, well, we've seen throughout history how that's often not the case. But like I said, it can be a reminder to look at something that you might have just glossed over otherwise.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks a lot to that interconnection piece. It's something I talk about in my own book too, is that idea of latching on to something because you feel or think that that's your identity, when in reality, ancestry is diffused, right? There's so many interconnections that really connect and create a web. And I think I really appreciated how you wrote this book in particular, is looking at kind of the family of all of these different cultures, the family of these beings as being found in multiple different cultures, but also evolving somewhat differently in each of these different cultures too. Can you speak a little bit about your process to research this and really describe for us kind of methodology used?
Okay, yes, certainly. So let me think. I mean, in the first chapter, I do get into the weeds a little bit. I speak about archaeology. I speak about ancient DNA. I speak about linguistics. And really what it boils down to is that Eastern Europe is a melting pot. It's a melting pot, sort of at a crossroads. And some people I know have raised their eyebrows a little bit at the connections that I draw all over the place. But I really do try to show that it's not just random dot connecting. In particular, the the ancient DNA is a great way of illustrating that. Once you realize that, half of the ancestry in Northern Europe can be traced back to a specific migration during the Middle Bronze Age. I mean, at that point, it's no longer so far-fetched to talk about these parallels as, representing something ancient. And I think, once you understand that context, it makes a lot more sense. Even for the Finno-Ugric people, I know some people have raised their eyebrows at that, saying, what, Indo-Europeans and Finno-Ugric people, they speak a different language. So where's the connection? But, I would encourage those people to look at some of the genetic data if they really think these people kept separate.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, people don't. I think people have it set in their head because of how maybe modern Europe and the nationalism movement of the past 200 years, that each of these different cultures are different, separate, and I mean, there's a big history to that. But I mean, even looking at British culture, right? The number of different peoples who have come into the British Isles and Irish Isles and diffused. And yet there's this idea that we're all separate people, that a few miles away they're not going to be connecting. That liminality is really important. I'd say probably around the world, liminality is really important.
Yeah, and I would definitely say that I believe in the uniqueness of different cultures. It gets a little bit tricky with the Slavs, though, because to get back to methodology a little bit, my main focus really is the religion of the early Slavs. And it's important to stress that, the early Slavs who migrated during the 6th century, 7th century AD, they were pretty unified, initially. Like, there was not a lot of variation in the early Slavic language during the early phase of those migrations. So yes, that's why I sort of jump around looking at these different Slavic countries, because I suppose, my primary interest is on those original, migrants who expanded throughout Eastern Europe and somehow assimilated essentially the eastern half of Europe, with a few pockets, that are exceptions. And yeah, I mean, looking at that common root shared by all of them is really fascinating for me. But there are methodological reasons to want to do that, because as I try to explain, one of the ways that you can actually show that a folk tale or a folk tradition is old is by looking at all the isolated communities that have preserved a similar narrative. If something shows up in one place, it really might be fairly new. But when you start seeing that it has been preserved by all these different isolated communities that have not been in recent contact with each other, that's one of the ways that you can argue that it's actually very ancient.
Absolutely, absolutely. For those who are listening to who are not necessarily aware of folklore studies and the approach to kind of looking at folklore through that kind of almost like a genetic lens, there are certain ways of approaching a story where using a motif index and other kind of tools that can really rip apart a story and show us all those common elements. And if a common element exists in this place and over here, maybe 1,000 miles away, and there's enough of a similarity in the story, even if the symbolic elements or the shallow elements are changed, chances are that they are very, very similar, or that they are connected, right?
Yes, scholars have been trying to sort of root out the origins of these different Arne Thompson type international folktale motifs, and there's a whole catalog of them, and they're really fascinating. And I don't attempt to explain why all these motifs are so widespread. All I'm saying is that they are related, essentially. Yeah. And yes, one that I talk about quite a bit is Arne Thompson type 480, which is also called the kind girl and the unkind girl. And this is a folktale type that is associated with Baba Yaga in Russia, also with Frau Holle in Germany. And yes, you can even go as far abroad as India and find a sort of analogous figure. I think they call her the woman in the moon, or the mother of the moon, in one Bengali version of this tale.
And is that the same tale type that shows up in Father Winter?
Yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, and I'm not the person who pointed this out first, but it has been observed that yes, Frau Hall is associated with winter, and she appears in Arne Thompson type 480, and in some cases, Father Winter or Morozko, Frost, Grandfather Frost, also is associated with winter and shows up in this tail type. And there are a lot of interesting little correspondences like that. There's a coherence if you actually look at all of the variations.
Absolutely, absolutely. It takes such a large sample size to really begin to pick up on these pieces. I'm curious then, this is more of a nerdy question here, but in studying and going back to kind of written sources and what's left of the folk narrative for the period that you looked at in this, what was the difficulty with that? Because obviously the motif index is looking at folk tales and legends, and most of those were written down in a particular period in the 19th century. There's not enough written material from 1,000 years ago, let alone 2,000 years ago, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. What difficulties did you find as you were getting into your particular time period?
Well, yeah, it's very difficult. You really have to connect it to a larger web of things. I think one thing that has helped a lot has been the Nart sagas, which have been translated, the Ossetian and also some other variants of the Nart sagas of the Northern Caucasus have been translated by Colarusso fairly recently. And I mean, every scholar agrees that these epics from the Northern Caucasus region are very old. And in fact, the Ossetian ones are sort of a remnant of a culture that used to be very widespread in Eastern Europe. I'm talking about the Iranian nomadic people called the Scythians and Sarmatians. So the last vestige of that linguistically really is the Ossetian language in the Northern Caucasus region. So that's why these sagas are so interesting. One of the reasons, anyway. And yes, the opening of one of these Nart Saga episodes is basically, it's almost identical to some Slavic openings for Arne Thompson 550, which is the golden bird, where you have this bird stealing golden apples from a garden, which is reminiscent of other, Indo-European cultural traditions as well. I think when we think of golden apples, most of us will think of Norse or Greek mythology. But in the Nart sagas, you have this very interesting variant where the bird who is stealing the golden apples turns into this beautiful woman who turns out to be the daughter of the sea god, Don Betir. And you see that almost that exact narrative sort of fossilized in some Slavic versions of this tale type. So there's obviously a connection there to an older tradition, and we don't always find proof of that. But that's an example of one story where the evidence for its antiquity is sort of caught on camera, so to speak.
Right. That makes sense. Looking for the shadows of that these ancient tellings and connections are casting. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so coming back to your process with this book in particular, then, you take a ADF approach, that cross-analysis piece, and in keeping all of those threads kind of connected. I guess I'm curious because I mean, it's such a massive amount of linkages that you make. It's such a massive amount of material that you drew from. What was your process to keep it all together? How did you keep all those threads kind of understandable for yourself?
I mean, I would go back to what I said about starting Indo-European studies basically at 14 years old, and I had a lot of very enthusiastic early attempts that just got tangled up, very quickly. So I mean, that did happen. I don't want to say that didn't. And that that started, I guess, close to 20 years ago now. So I mean, there was a lot of trial and error, and even fairly recently, I know I was trying blog posts and taking them down. So there has been a lot of weeding, I suppose. And I think one of the things that has been critical for me though is criticizing myself honestly, because a lot of there's a lot of scholarship out there on Slavic paganism, and it doesn't get questioned a whole lot. But I can say that I've been through a lot of iterations. All right. So as far as how I avoided getting things tangled, I mean, I would go back to what I said previously about really getting into Indo-European studies at, the age of 14, which is pretty close to 20 years ago now. And I would say that I had a lot of, very enthusiastic early attempts that sort of did get tangled up and really didn't end up going anywhere. And I would say that, self-criticism is very important for something like that. I mean, it took a long time before I found connections that I really was satisfied with, and I thought that they were just too intricate to really deny, or at least too intricate to just wave off as coincidence.
Mhm.
And I mean, yeah, you have to put those ideas to the test, and in some cases that means finding a lot of connections so that you can say, well, okay, I thought that there was evidence before, but now there's even a little bit more. And when you keep finding more and more, I think that's encouraging. But as far as how to really avoid any kind of tangling, I think there's also some truth to the idea that things were tangled a long time ago. That's one thing that I don't know if I explain in detail enough in this book, because you want to give people a sort of a coherent system or a coherent answer, and I do provide some of that, but I think I could also have taken some more time to say that, all of these different Slavic tribes who migrated across a huge swath of territory during the 6th and 7th centuries, they were not all the same. So what I'm reconstructing here is something that would probably be very familiar to them, but we should not expect that it was, monolithic or anything like that.
That's one of the, I would say that's one of the major criticisms of the Reconstructionist movement in neo-paganism, is the idea that, you can reconstruct and you can build a monolithic kind of approach, when in reality regionalism is huge and regionalism is very, very important. From one, or even a span of 5 miles can generate very different approaches to working with the same deities of the same ancestral spirits or whatever. And so I think that that's a really important approach. I'm curious then, when it came to the audience that you were writing this for, Moonbook's book is geared towards neo-pagans. It's written very much like an academic text, though. And I'm curious for you, what did you hope the general reader would get out of it, knowing that it's a Moonbook's pagan?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, I mean, I have more than one goal, really. First and foremost, yes, I think, it can be disappointing to try and look into a tradition and just find nothing.
Right.
And I did want to show that, that's not necessarily the case. And, even if you are not sold on, every argument in the book, there's over 700 citations there, and you can sort of decide for yourself. But the one thing that you can say is that there's nothing there, which I think, we've all read some books that just felt a little bit light, or like we were trying to find something that just never showed up. And I didn't want that. I wanted to offer something substantial for people, and then they can do what they like with it. I predict that, a lot of people will at least find something that they can use to sort of flesh out their idea of Slavic paganism, and, sort of help to bolster it. I don't know, if they'll accept everything. It probably depends on the person. And then, on the other hand, though, I think, I don't know, I'm a little bit frustrated with the way that the field has sort of stood still for so long. I mean, Ivanov and Toporov, as prestigious as they were, I mean, their scholarship from the 1980s is dated in a lot of ways. I mean, if you try to read about Ivanov's, Armenian homeland hypothesis for the spread of the Indo-European languages, which has them rounding the Caspian Sea to get to the Eurasian steppe, it feels so dated nowadays, and it feels like it's a little bit overdue. And I would say that it's not just me. There have been a few scholars, like for instance, Luchinsky's book, on the Slavic mythology that is in Polish. Most people may not be able to read it, but that's another very recent one that has sort of called into question a lot of the conventional wisdom on Slavic mythology. So I don't think it's just me. I think there's kind of a general movement towards reanalyzing a lot of these conceptions, and I would like to be a part of it.
I think you've succeeded in that. Coming from the background I come from a religious studies background. I'm currently studying medieval and classical, and one of the issues with kind of the Slavic pantheon, particularly specifically, is most of the material is in a Slavic language, is in Polish, is in Russian, is in Ukrainian, right? And many of the texts are in English of a certain caliber are academic texts. They're going to be 80, 100, 120, sometimes $200, right? And so then that becomes so inaccessible. I have also noticed that the majority of the academic material is really focused on Rodnovery and kind of the resurgence of that nationalistic approach to religion in Eastern Europe and Russia. And it doesn't necessarily speak to the broader kind of context in, say, North America or other places. So it's really, really focused on a geopolitical issue right now, as opposed to looking at it from a kind of a lived traditional background.
Yeah, I think the language barrier even holds true in Eastern Europe to an extent. I mean, you would think that there would have been this massive push to sort of synthesize the folk traditions of every single Slavic country and sort of analyze all of them in a systematic way. And, I've looked and I really don't think that has happened. And it raises a question of, why these divisions have been so pervasive. Obviously, there are reasons for the divisions, but, it does seem like it may have impacted scholarship to some extent.
It's a weird sort of thing. We were discussing briefly before we started recording. So I'm taking a Slavic studies class right now. We were looking at Afanasiev, the kind of major folkloric collector of the 1800s for Russia, and it's interesting how the parallels between Imperial Russia and Soviet Russia. In maintaining the status quo, one of the biggest issues Afanasiev dealt with was the Slavophile elites in Russia wanting to reject all modernism, reject Westernism, reject all of that, and seeing peasant culture, i.e. folktales, as being kind of against their status quo. I know the Orthodox Church was really against him as well. Very different from kind of the Grimms in Germany, kind of before the unification of that. Do you feel like there's, at least in the diaspora, that there's a real interest without those hang-ups?
Oh, speaking about the diaspora, well, it's well known that the Russian diaspora is culturally very different from, I would say, the mainstream of Russia. That has long been the case. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this because I studied the Russian language. I find it interesting. I think there's a lot of excellent stuff to read in that language, and I think even the current tensions will pass one day, although I don't know when. And it's just it's hard because the Soviet Union, it wasn't always a complete villain. I mean, they tried to harmonize all these different ethnic groups. But I think you have to admit that, their focus on reconstructing Slavic paganism was, pretty limited sometimes. And they despite their efforts, they could be very leery about including every ethnic group. I think, there's an excellent book by Bogdan Rubchak on, the Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, which is a Ukrainian classic. And in his notes, he talks about the Russian reluctance to actually include Ukrainian folklore or to call it Ukrainian when they do include it. And it seems like something that is a serious issue if you're trying to build a common Slavic, repertoire of folklore.
Absolutely. I think it's something that a lot of listeners looking from the outside in might be shocked about. But when we look at kind of the politics of Europe and many European cultures, you get that you get a similar marginalization. I know in France, one of the biggest issues is saying that Breton folklore is actually Celtic and not French. There's a lot of push to Francify many of the kind of regional areas. Same in Britain and the UK. Even saying British folklore as opposed to Scottish, English, and Welsh folklore is something that is quite widespread and very insidious in many ways. Mm-hmm. What was it like for you then, as somebody who was born in Texas, American, even with these roots, to dive into that milieu and start to work things out for yourself? I know you said you've been really immersed in this since 14, but what cultural lenses did you have to learn in order to become savvy with this material?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have mentioned that I started out with Indo-European studies,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a good start. But I mean, it was a very different thing to actually try and learn about the early Slavs, because that is such a politicized topic. I talk about the Polish autochthonous school, which tries to place the Proto-Slavs in modern-day Poland, and also I talk about some people in the Balkans even who want to sort of establish their antiquity in that region. And I would say that I really didn't I didn't have like a preconceived notion either way, and I think that's an important thing for this topic. Now, as far as understanding, I mean, for one thing, it's hard to make the case that we have this really strong living connection to that tradition. I mean, even if you grew up in Eastern Europe, it would still be true that you really didn't understand where a lot of these stories came from. You might hear stories about Baba Yaga, but it's quite possible you could grow up in Russia without knowing the context, without knowing that there's an Arne Thompson type, version of this tale that is basically international. And I guess, I followed the guideline that, there is a lot of stuff in Slavic folklore that is undeniably pagan, but it's also very ambiguous. It's hard to say what this story means. If you read the story of Ivan the Cow's son with zero context, I mean, it's difficult to say what that means. It seemed like a very random story about these three children who, grow up very quickly and they become heroes, and one of them fights dragons. And there's a woman who turns into a bird whose grandfather comes out of the sea. And you might say, okay, that sounds very pagan, but what does that actually mean? And these are the same questions that you would have no matter where you grew up, because the full explanation doesn't exist anywhere. So I would say, I just followed the guideline that all of this stuff is best understood in context. And that's why there are so many parallels. It's not that I'm saying these things are all the same. I guess what I'm saying is that before you even begin to interpret these stories, you need this broader context. Otherwise, your interpretation is probably going to be very subjective.
Absolutely. And that subjectivity is where a lot of mistakes and a lot of the biases and a lot of the lenses that you're not even aware of can pop in. Absolutely. So with that then, knowing that this would be going out to a much broader kind of audience, people from all over the place, people from all... what was most pressing for you to get across in this?
Oh, wow, there's a lot of things.
Sorry, Troy. Really putting you into it.
Yeah, so I mean, some of it is stuff that I've touched on before, but let me try to put it together in a coherent way. So like I've said, I didn't want people to think that there was nothing out there. I think I wanted to show people that folklore does have a lot of value for this type of analysis. I feel like it's underappreciated in a lot of ways. I know a lot of scholars don't like folklore because, it's very hard to take this thing that was recorded in the 19th century and say, well, this is connected to all of these ancient beliefs and all these ancient practices. And some people from the 19th century really kind of ruined that for everybody because they took so many liberties with folklore and with fairy tales. But then on the other hand, when you have a story from the Nart sagas of the Northern Caucasus, which many scholars love. Many scholars love the Nart sagas of the Northern Caucasus, and they have no doubts that it reflects this archaic ancient tradition. It seemed kind of arbitrary to have this division between that and a very similar story just because it happens to be folklore. I mean, if it's the same story of a bird that steals golden apples and then turns into a fairy tale maiden or a supernatural woman, isn't it kind of arbitrary to have this wedge and say, well, this is folklore and the other thing is mythology? And I really wanted to highlight that because, yes, it is difficult to work with folklore. I know that very well. But I think a lot of people just give up on it, and it's not warranted.
Yeah, I agree. There's a great bias against folklore. And I think if people actually saw what it was, not just a like children's fantasy, would actually understand that it's very applicable to life right now. But even things in our regular culture had their roots in folk culture that is emerged from. So that actually is a good point to lead into my next. I always like to ask this because you have a great passion for this subject, but this wasn't just an academic exercise for you. How does this relate to your personal spirituality? What kind of how does your personal spirituality show up?
Yeah, so I mean, the first layer of my spirituality, I would say, is really pretty universalist. I have a great respect for the cultural, distinctiveness of different traditions. I wouldn't want to put them all through a blender or anything like that, just to homogenize them. But yes, I would say that I start with a perspective of universality, at least in the sense of saying that, all these different traditions have some validity to them, and I have no real reason to, declare one of them false or anything like that. And yes, you can sometimes find me at a Unitarian Universalist church because it's a wonderful community. But then, that's just the first layer. I would say that, once you have that, sort of broad view, it's still important to find something that is specific to yourself. And I mentioned that I'm a sucker for an untold story. And I think that really gets to the heart of it for me, if I'm being honest, because I mean, yes, this is a tradition that needs some love, to be honest. There's a lot of traditions that will be just fine without me. I mean, I am half Jewish. I could, launch into a huge study of Canaanite mythology one day. But if I did that, I think what I would most likely end up doing is just deferring to experts on many points. And it would be very educational. But the end result would be that I would defer to all these experts with their, incredibly learned, opinions on Canaanite mythology. And I guess the reason I've gravitated more towards, the Slavic tradition is because I feel like there are all of these breakages and all these question marks. And, it's a story that hasn't been completely told. And I think that's very captivating. And as far as my personal spirituality, I mean, yes, obviously I don't live in Eastern Europe. I would love to go to the Carpathian Mountains. There is a sense of connection there. And you write about this in your book, about the disconnect between, the regions that you might romanticize or the regions that you might see yourself as coming from and where you actually are. And I mean, after thinking about it, I've come to realize that, yes, whatever your practice is or whatever your identity is, it does need to be rooted in what is local. There's really no way around that. So a lot of our ancestors would have a story about the landscape that they lived in and where that came from. I think one of the favorite stories that I mentioned in my book is the East Slavic narrative about the origin of the dragon's ramparts or the dragon's furrow, where the two twin plowmen harnessed a dragon to a plow and plowed out this massive furrow. And you can find a few different versions of that type of narrative. It's actually very similar in some ways to the Krakow Foundation myth, or foundation legend involving the two sons of Krak. And that story also ends with the dragon being so thirsty that it drinks from the river until it bursts. Um, and but for the early Slavs, the distance between the Dnieper and Krakow must have seemed immense. I mean, they were migrating people during the 6th century, so they must have adapted considerably. I mean, imagine the climate difference between Bulgaria and Russia. It's such a vast territory. And I think, when you look at the Slavic migrations, there's kind of a hidden message there about the ability of culture to mutate, even as it, spreads from a single point.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is, I think, the fascinating thing between kind of old world and new world kind of perspectives on landscape and land, right? In Europe, the perspective is so much smaller, right? Like coming from the UK, I always laugh when I say that, my trip to university campus is 2 hours away. And so me driving 2 hours and 2 hours back is just a regular day for me, right? In the UK, that's like, side of the country, what? There's those different spaces, right? But going back to the ancient peoples, their sense of landscape, their sense of distance, of territory was so much different from us. Traveling an hour is a 5-minute car ride for us, right? Very, very different sense. Absolutely. I'm curious then to kind of pick up on something you said there then. And I already told you I was going to ask you this before we were recording, so it shouldn't be a surprise to you. But I often like to ask people in the diaspora who are practicing old world or how then these spirits, how these deities, how these beings show up in your local. Different diasporic communities have different answers for that and different perspectives on that. So for you growing up in Texas, what part of Texas are you from, by the way? No, you don't need to give address, don't worry.
Oh, yeah. Well, I should say I'm in the Austin area.
Okay. So in the Austin area, how do some of these beings, like Volos or Perun or Svarog or whoever, how do they show up in your local landscape? How do you connect with them on the local level for you, if you do?
Yeah. So I mean, I think for anyone living in an urban setting, it can be a little bit of a challenge. I would say that I do try to find areas that at least have forest, at least have rivers, things like that. I think when talking about a lot of the spirits in Slavic folklore, bodies of water are very important. There are a lot of stories about the Rusalki or the Boginki who come out of the water at a certain season. In East Slavic folklore, especially, you have the stories connecting them with fertility and bringing fertility to the land. And I would say I definitely gravitate towards fresh water sources. Those are very important for me. And yeah, it is interesting that in Polish, the term for these types of nymph, boginki, is basically little goddesses. It's the diminutive form of goddess, and that makes a lot of sense. And the idea that these nature spirits are sort of connected with a deity is important as well. I think in my book I mention a Russian story about the Rusalki, who are about to basically drown a man, but then they say that they hear their elder calling to them, and so they return back to wherever they come from. And there are a number of instances of this odd connection between a deity and nature spirits, and also the spirits of the dead. I would say in Austin it can be a bit of a challenge. I think it's actually a little bit easier in some places, like for instance when I go out to Bandera. But I do think that being close to some kind of a gateway where nature can shine through is important for connecting. And then when I can't do that, I don't know. I would say that it's important to recognize that the urban setting that you live in today is kind of a blip. Texas was not always like this, and I don't know if this is foreboding, but I don't think it always will be like this in this specific area. I just don't see it lasting forever. So I mean, when you think about it that way, nature is not really ever that far away.
And I think too, kind of touching on what I heard anyways on the there was that piece around, again, that transitory nature, that changing of the tradition. I'm thinking specifically around like I'm trying to say here. I think the assumption that in neo-paganism a lot of times is that all of these traditions were nature-based and they have to be landed in the land and that they're connected with the land and all of these deities are genius. I think that is coming to become a bias now, when in reality so much diversity in even just European traditions between kind of land-based genius loci deities, spirits and gods versus the more simple structure. Think of, like cults in groves and the mindset that they didn't really have deities that were really anthropomorphized until but I mean, looking at the sources, or many of the historical sources for Slavic deities have the old.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
Oh, I said the poles in the temples. What are they called? I can't think what they're called now. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, the poles in temples. No, I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
No, so I know in modern kind of Rodnovery and those.
Oh yes.
The temples are a really big important piece. It's temple worship, and within them you have the deity poles, the god poles, and I can't think what they're called because there's all different versions and names for them. But that sense of these are no longer just landed in. They're not places that you go to. They're not deities that you only encounter in the landscape. They are now temple deities. In your local area, in your groups that you work with, have you noticed that there's a mimicking then of other traditions that are more temple based in their approach to these days?
So a mimicking of temple based worship. You mean despite the fact that we are in a different location?
Yes, I'm not even sure what I'm asking here. I guess what I'm essentially asking is kind of how have you seen, based on what you've been studying in this and writing in this, what do you see these traditions have evolved into in the neo-pagan landscape? If that makes sense.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Sorry, Troy.
So yeah, I mean it's important to, I don't think I mentioned community much. I should mention ADF briefly, because none of these traditions were, completely individualist. That was never the case historically, and there are reasons why neo-paganism is as individualistic as it is, to some extent, for such a small tradition or such a small movement. It's necessary for individuals to sort of seek out their own path. But ADF, does have a very sort of localized approach where you have many different groves. They actually refer to the different institutions or the different groups as groves. And, they tend to be based on, they tend to vary a lot from place to place. Even though they're unified by sort of similar approaches, they tend to be very big on Celtic paganism. But then there's also an element of Indo-European studies as well. And I would say that there's kind of a recognition that a lot of the old tribes don't exist anymore. I mean, some people will try to project identities from the present back into the past, or vice versa. But the truth is that a lot of these old tribes don't truly exist anymore, even though you can have bits and pieces of them, and sort of repurpose or sort of draw upon fragments of the traditions that they believed in. The reality is that, when we're talking about groups in the modern world, we're talking about new groups, essentially, or, new tribes, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely. That changing of or recreating or forming of new identities based on perceptions. Absolutely. Okay. I'm not sure what else to ask you, Troy, to be honest. This has been fantastic. Go and buy the book. It's available now through Moonbooks. I'm pretty sure most Western countries you can access this. I know in North America and Europe, definitely. I think Australia, they're still waiting for these to come in, but it's out. You can. Troy, last kind of comments. What do you want people to really focus on when they're reading this?
What do I want them to think?
What do you want them to focus on when they're reading this?
What to focus on? Well, I end the first chapter saying that, this is not random dot connecting. There is, there's substantial evidence for all these cultures being interrelated. You can look at it linguistically, you can look at it archaeologically, you can look at it even genetically. I know that, just because people share certain things doesn't mean that their traditions are the same. But there is a reason for looking at all of these parallels. And yeah, I mean, when you find correspondences across a vast area, that actually is an argument for its antiquity. When you find something in lots of different locations, you can say these people have not been in touch with each other for a long time. So this is something probably very old.
I'd love to thank you for coming on. This has been fantastic, Troy. I really, really enjoyed our chat today. How can people find you? I know there's the links below, but are there any other things that you're doing? This comes out in November time, so are there any events that people can connect with, or what are you doing? Anything you'd like to plug?
Well, I don't have anything scheduled for that time specifically. I would like to reiterate that I'm active in ADF. There is actually a Slavic kin group within ADF, and just to clarify, that is Arndreocht Fane, our own druidry, which is not just about Celtic paganism. As I mentioned, there's a Slavic kin group, and there is a lot of variation within that organization. I think it could be rewarding for a lot of people.
ADF is very well known in the Celtic community over in North America here. They have groves throughout. You can go to, I think it's adf.com, and it's currently led by the wonderful Drum, who I understand has been doing some amazing work. I think it's Drum who's leading it, right?
Pagano, yes.
Yes, that's right. Okay, I'll put that link down below as well, because a lot of all of the various other groups connect with ADF, whether it be Celtic. I know that they have a Middle Eastern and like a Vedic approach too, as part of that. I will put that down below. That could be of interest to people. In the meantime, I've been Ben Stimson. This has been Troy Kokoszka, and from both of us, have a good rest of the night, folks.
Thank you.